Hi all, welcome back to the John Deere B tractor restoration, and as you can see we've got all the selectors put back inside the gearbox. We discussed this in the last video. Unfortunately though, once you put the selectors in it all becomes a little bit cluttered inside there, so you can't exactly see what's going on too well. But they're the individual selectors that we had out on the bench, and that low range selector there. You can see the pawls here with the little stubby bit sticking out on each one, and if you recall, on the other end of that pawl there was like a mushroom shaped thing which fitted into the, as you move the selector, the mushroom type thing fitted into the detent, one of which you can see there. So yeah, there you go. I mean, there's not a lot more you can say really about it. Other than, quite important, I did mention that the selectors hold the gears in the correct place to be meshed with each other. And you have that to adjust to some extent. And the adjuster is in the side here, that little bolt. That bolt, once it's tightened up, holds the end of the shaft tight against a nut type of deal inside, and that allows the shaft to move in and out. That bolt there nips down onto a flat on top of that shaft in there, and that stops the shaft moving, and therefore the detents are in the correct plane for the pawls and selectors to work on. So it's quite imperative that you get that correct. In the book it has quite a paragraph or two about it, but basically the idea is that you get the gears so they're both running pretty well together. You don't want them running slightly off line with each other, because obviously the load is getting transmitted into one consistent spot. You want the load across the whole of the teeth of the gear. But saying that, it's all a bit of a compromise, because on this one, when I got the gears really lined up where I wanted them, unfortunately the selector gears, hang on a minute, I'll get it and then we can see what we're doing. The gear stick, when it comes through obviously the cover, there's the end of the gear stick there. So it sits in something like this, and it sits like that. But when I had the gears in the correct plane that I wanted them in, that I thought was correct, the gear stick end was binding up just in here, just in that point. And as you can see, where they get that ball on the end of the gear stick sticks, it just is slightly offline in there. Now, whether that's due to wear, poor manufacturing, I don't know. But anyway, as I say, it's all a bit of a compromise. So I pushed the shaft a bit across that way. The gear stick now nicely moves between all three selectors. So I think we're going to have to live with that one. The high-low selector there, that has its own separate, obviously its own separate little gear stick, and that sits in that groove, and that allows that to move side to side. So at the moment it's obviously in low range. If I can do this, there we go, it is now in high range, and you might have heard it clunk there, and it's now, the two gears are running, those two gears are running together there. You can't, as I say, see it too well, so unfortunately. So a lot more we can say about that. There really isn't. Switch the light off. So over on the bench, I have dismantled the transmission cover, this piece. So that goes on top of the gearbox. The gear stick goes through there with a ball inside, like a ball and socket. and then obviously you have your goes that way. You have your gear stick selector gate there, and there's your high and low stick. I've taken it out, but there it is, and there is the selector rod that goes inside, that moves on the high range, low range selector. So I'm going to I'll shot blast all those bits and get them all cleaned up, and we can get some paint on them, and I'll get it put back on the tractor. Now I want to put that back on because it'll keep the muck out of the dust, I should say, out of the top of the gearbox. Yeah. So there we go. Gearbox nearly done. I suspect. The only other thing we've got to do is put that cover on here. As you can see, there's that bent arm selector I was talking about. Comes down onto this 6th gear, and there it sits. The one slight thing I didn't mention, of course, this is a 6-speed gearbox. There were quite a few styled John Deeres, especially at the wartime, only had 4 speeds. I suspect it would be a cost-cutting measure. Certainly a lot of them that came over to the UK on the Lend-Lease system had 4-speed gearboxes on them. That BN, which is a genuine Lend-Lease tractor, I can trace that back, its history right back to when it was delivered into Lincolnshire. It only came with a 4-speed gearbox. It looks similar to this inside, but obviously the 5th and 6th gears are missing. Of all the covers there, but the 5th and 6th gears are missing, and there's no 5th and 6th selector rod. So yeah. I do have that gearbox to take to bits actually. I did have it to bits when I rebuilt the tractor, but foolishly I didn't replace all the bearings, and it's always had a bit of a noisy bearing. I suspect it's in the bottom set of gears in the bottom. So I will do that gearbox one day. So yeah, so there we go. One other problem I've come across, in my haste to put that, going back to the engine now, in my haste to put that oil pump in, one or two of you that might have spotted it, David has not put the camshaft follower back in, which, let me get that torch there, which obviously bolts up underneath these 3 holes, and inside you can see the shaft coming up from the oil pump, and of course that's driven off the camshaft followers and ultimately from the camshaft, and of course you better have that in before you put the oil pump in. Oops. So over here on the bench again, I've cleaned all the camshaft follower up. There it is. It sits inside the tractor like that, so it's pointing forward. Push rods sit in these cam followers. They sit there. So the camshaft's behind here, runs behind here. That gear there sits inside the housing and protrudes through here. And the camshaft, there's a gear obviously on the camshaft, and it drives the that gear there, which ultimately, this gear here, which ultimately drives the oil pump. But of course, this square drive comes into play. Just put it on there. Now that square drive connects the gear in the camshaft follower with the shaft to the oil pump. And of course, with the oil pump being fixed and this being fixed, you've got to put all of them together in one go. So I will unfortunately have to just slacken the oil pump off, drop this into the top of the engine, into the crankcase, and it will all go back together correctly. It's just my haste to put the oil pump in. There you go. So yeah, interestingly, when I took it all apart, I found that sitting inside this housing. Now you might recognise that as the as a pin for the governor weights. And so it has had some trauma at some point in its life in the governor, where the governors have obviously dropped to bits. But as I say, it was in there. So it's a good job I have actually taken it all apart, because I can see that being could have damaged some gears or whatever. That square drive is a bit of a funny old thing. They talk of that as if it's some sort of shear protection for the oil pump. And the idea is, and I think it's right, but the idea is if you should get water build up inside your crankcase and it should freeze enough to freeze the oil pump up. Of course, if it was a rigid drive, it would damage the oil pump when the engine started. And so the idea is that square thing breaks, that coupling breaks, and therefore it doesn't damage your oil pump. But my argument is, and I don't know how valid this is, my argument is that by the time that all that's happened, then there's already damage done to the engine because it's obviously starved of oil. So the bearings are starved of oil. So I don't know how valid that story is, but I believe that is correct. It is some form of oil pump protection coupling. But there you go. So as I say, I think we'll get that put back in correctly and get the oil pump back in, and then we'll shop blast all these gear stick components and the cover, and just bolt that onto the top of the gearbox for now. It'll only be bolted on loosely because it's just really, as I say, just to keep the dust out. So yeah, so it's getting there. Okay then, thanks for watching. Bye.